the issue of the Sabbath is something that I brought up multiple times on this channel before. I made a video about this topic previously in which I cited some Greek and some Russian sources showing that throughout history, up until even the modern age, it is part and parcel of the Orthodox Church to celebrate and recognize and observe the Sabbath, but not quite in the manner of modern-day rabbinics, nor in the manner of the Sinai Covenant, of which no Christians are a part of, because we're part of the New Covenant. However, that doesn't mean that we just completely ignore the Sabbath or say it's just a day of the week and it's not important whatsoever to recognize it. Even the Roman Catholic Church or the Latin Catholic Church, they do in fact accept that Saturday is called the day of Sabbath, but they don't do anything on it. Centuries ago, there was some reverence for it, but even at its earliest stage, the Latin Church, in particular the papacy, always had a problem with the way in which the quote-unquote Eastern Church practiced the Sabbath. There was a pope, in fact, who said that the way in which the Greeks, and we'll get into the issue of why it's wrong for him to call the Orthodox Church the Greeks, but the point is, he says, the Greeks are Jewish. They're Judaizers. They're like that sect of the Nazarenes who are out in the Syro-Jordanian desert. They're Judaizers, keeping the law of Moses for salvation, which is what the Pope accused them of doing, but not what they were actually doing. And so the Greeks make themselves like the Jews. That was the accusation of the Pope at that time. So we got to break down two important elements in his accusation. The first one is the theological aspect. So the accusation is that it is Jewish, meaning rabbinic, meaning against the New Testament, against the New Covenant, to partake in anything that has a direct correlation with the Old Testament. Now, a lot of Latin Catholics will say, well, look, our Eucharist is like the sacrifice of the Old Testament, and we have a lot of other parallels. So they don't have a problem with parallels from the Old Testament. But any direct continuity with an actual established practice from the Old Testament, the Latin Church has always been extremely wary of, especially those that can be misconstrued as Judaizing. So only in the Latin Church is there any kind of pain involved with circumcision. By pain, I mean like pain of anathema or excommunication. You're not going to be anathematized or excommunicated in the Orthodox Church for partaking of circumcision, but it has to be something cultural. It's not a signification of anything salvific, and it has nothing to do with being brought into the covenant, because that is fulfilled in baptism. But the issue with the Latin Church, saying that any other kind of practices, such as the Sabbath, are Jewish, because they're a direct continuity from the Old Testament, they would have to get rid of baptism then, as would all the Protestants, because baptism, the Greek baptismo, comes from the word immerser, and that is the exact word used for the Levitical rite of purity found in the Torah. So you can't baptize anymore either, that's too Jewish. That would be one problem with their accusation toward the Greeks. The second problem with the accusation toward the Greeks, there's actually three. I said two, but there's actually three problems. The second is misconstruing any practice of the law with being some kind of salvific replacement for justification. So the Orthodox Church doesn't really care for Protestant terminology, but if we are going to look at Protestant terminology to make some kind of allegorical comparison, sanctification and justification are ways in which we can kind of understand the way in which the Church always approached the law. So they wouldn't use the word sanctification versus justification, but they would say, as a matter of fact, the law is not building your salvation. It's not going to earn you some kind of like point ranking system. You're not getting a token to go into an arcade game and buy your salvation because you did the Sabbath. Rather, these are ordinances put on earth because God wants men and women to understand how to live a proper life. And his cosmic ordinance, this cosmic reality called the Sabbath, which long precedes any law of Moses, long precedes any Sinai contract, is just a natural reality. And so in God, he has chosen this is the way in which the cosmos is to be understood. Just like how the Orthodox Church doesn't necessarily recognize this whole, oh, it's New Year's Eve stuff. Like, that has absolutely nothing to do with the Orthodox calendar. It has nothing to do with the seasons found in the Old Testament, and you don't have to be a Judaizer to believe in any of that. The Orthodox Church also believes that a day, as I've said many times before, I've said in my book, begins at sunset, not at midnight, and not at sunrise. So again, that's an Old Testament understanding of reality. And so the confusion comes from, hey, you're doing something like the Old Testament, you're a Jew. That's not true, because there's many things that have nothing to do with the contract between Moses and the Hebrews established at Mount Sinai with God, because the Sabbath takes place long before then. It's just a reality of the world. It's like saying there's air. Well, air existed before the law of Moses, and it exists after the law of Moses too. We all breathe air. It's a reality, and the Sabbath is a natural reality, and that's something the Orthodox Church recognizes, as do they recognize the fact that sunset is the beginning of a new day. So this is the way in which the Byzantine Empire kept time. Not even Byzantine. Now we're going to focus on the linguistic aspect. It's not just Byzantine, it's Eastern Roman. This word Byzantine is kind of a Western overreaction, a kind of otherness pointed at the Eastern Roman Empire. So when you have the Pope saying the Greeks, or you have any other Latin scholastic theologian saying the Greeks do X, Y, Z, the Greeks do this, the Greeks do that, those are all just accusatory, those are all just polemics, really. It's accusatory language. The Greeks didn't call themselves Greek. Okay, the word Greek, the nation Greece, obviously, today it means a national of Greece who has origins in that homeland. However, that's not what it means historically. Historically, up until the arrival of British intellectuals in the 1800s into Greece, Greeks didn't say they were Greek. The word for Greek at that time in their language would have been the equivalent of saying Hellenic. So they didn't say they're Hellenic, they said they're Roman. So from the establishment of the Christian Roman Empire, and even before the age of Constantine, the language they spoke, which we call Greek, was just called Roman. The people identified not as Greeks, not as Hellenic people, because that was associated with Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, and all the pagans before them, such as Zeus, the god Zeus, Poseidon, and Odysseus, and Achilles, and Troy, and all that stuff from Homer. The Olympian religion, that was considered being a Hellen. They didn't call themselves Hellenes. They called themselves Romans. But if the Latin West, and that's a whole other issue we have to get into, is going to call itself Roman, there cannot be two Roman empires. So if the Germanics and the Franks, which, the border between what was considered Germanic and Frank was very blurred throughout a lot of history, if the Germanics and the Franks are calling themselves the Romans, then surely the Greeks can't be the Romans. And so we can do an entire show on the issue with calling people the Greeks, but it's just an accusatory language. The real people they were attacking were the Romans. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was the Roman Empire. Even in Islamic theology, the Eastern Romans are considered the Roman Empire. And that's why the Orthodox Christians today are called Rum, Roman. That's what it means. So there's no such thing as Roman Catholicism in Arabic. If you're going to say Roman Catholicism, it's going to get confused as Eastern Orthodoxy, because they're already saying Orthodox Church of the Romans. That's what an Orthodox is, so you're Roman. And Rome means Byzantine, it doesn't mean the Franks. So that's one of the main polemics that they have against the Orthodox Church. Say, oh, the Greeks, those pesky Homeric Greeks are doing the Jewish Sabbath. So they're Hellenic and Homeric Greeks, and they're Jews at the same time. That's the mastery, the sleight of hand in that sentence. So you have all these thoughts racing through your head. Oh, okay, these Homeric pagan Greeks, but now they're Jews. So they're Jewish Greeks. And so it's just a meaningless accusation. But when we look throughout history, beyond just the Greeks, the Romans, obviously, there are many other examples. It's not just the lands of today's Greece and Anatolia where you see people practicing the Sabbath. It's not some special Byzantine thing that nobody else knew about. There are a variety of sources, which I'm displaying here on the screen at the moment. That we have sources from Abyssinia, so that's Ethiopia. We have sources from Egypt, from the time of Origen, and even earlier than that. We have sources showing us that Ambrose of Milan practiced the Sabbath in some way. We have, in addition to that, as far away as the Church of the East, as the Nestorian Church in the Indian subcontinent, practicing the Sabbath, and the Nestorians in southern Anatolia practicing the Sabbath, and even people in Spain, parts of Ireland, and other places that were Christianized early on but not officially dogmatized into what you would today call Latin or Catholic theology. So throughout history, you can see that the idea of the Sabbath is replete. And so that's why a lot of people also get confused at the Tewahedo Church in Eritrea and Ethiopia. They think, they're Jewish. They do circumcision. Okay, that's a cultural thing, first of all. And they make that very clear that's a cultural thing. Well, they do the Sabbath. That can't be cultural. Well, in a way it is, because they had previously been a Jewish kingdom, so they're inheriting their local culture. But on top of that, they're not doing the Sabbath for salvific purposes. So as we've already stated, the remainder of Eastern Christianity and even early Western Christianity did observe the Sabbath. So nothing that the Ethiopian and Eritrean churches are doing is Jewish. Okay, they don't want to eat pork, they don't have to eat pork. St. Paul says in his epistle to the Romans, which he wrote in Greek, by the way, not Latin, that you cannot judge a man in food or drink. So that works the other way around too. So if somebody's going to command you, you can't eat this because I say you can't, you're allowed to ignore him, according to St. Paul. But St. Paul also is implying that people who don't want to eat something, you can't force them to eat it. So the Ethiopian and Eritrean churches are fine if they don't want to eat those foods. It's up to them, it's up to their culture, as is circumcision. And the Sabbath, we've already discussed, was replete throughout the whole church. So there's no problem with them enacting these practices. You even have St. Ignatius himself says that we follow the Sabbath not in the manner of the Jews. So by the Jews, whenever any Christian church father says that, they're already living in a time where the word Jew, Yehudai, however you want to explain it in any language, Judean, does not mean the Israelites of Moses' day per se. It's talking about rabbinics, although that word hadn't really been invented yet, who follow the Pharisaical sect and reject the New Testament, reject the New Covenant, they reject Christ, so they're not Christians. But somebody who's ethnically Jewish and became a Christian would not be referred to in that category. Anyway, when St. Ignatius is saying, we don't do the Sabbath in the way of the Yehudai, the Judeans, the Jewish people, he's saying, we don't, delete people for picking up a stick on the Sabbath, as was done no time at all before Moses, by the way. Now, one prophet before Moses ever observed the Sabbath in that manner, but only from Moses until Christ was that ordinance set apart, because of the manner in which those Israelites had their salvation given to them was a very strict theocratic system, a system of governance that God commanded absolute perfection. See, I can't even form a sentence perfectly. And of course, the Israelites couldn't live up to those perfect demands. But the laws were extremely strict, stricter than they had been beforehand, and stricter than they would be in the New Covenant. And that's made explicitly clear throughout the New Testament, not just in the Gospels, but in the epistle writings as well. So we don't observe it in the way of the rabbinics, where I can't turn on the lights, I can't tear a paper towel or something because of the Sabbath. We don't believe in things of that nature, but we do observe it in a way. So for the Pope to call the Greeks, aka the real Romans, Jewish because they observe the Sabbath is, I would even say, borderline blasphemous, because if you look at the 7th chapter of Prophet Daniel, God says pretty clearly that those who are against him in the future will change his laws and his times. So what are the times? That means the Sabbath, number one. That also means how you tell time. And as I say in a few chapters of my book, Misunderstood Bible 2nd Edition, which you can buy on my channel or in the description of this video, in that book I describe at length that the Orthodox Church is following the ordinance set in the book of Genesis. That we do, in fact, say a day begins at sunset. That's just how God designed creation. That's not up to some patriarch. That's not up to an ecumenical council. That's not up to the Pope. That's up to God. That was already set apart. That's not a law. That's a reality. The sun is in the sky. That's not a law. That's a reality. It's a heavenly body that you must acknowledge exists, whether you like it or not. And so as you can see throughout all these examples that I've shown you, from the Russians, from the Greeks, from the Copts, from the Ethiopian church even long before they separated from the Alexandrian Rite, from the Coptic church, from ancient churches in southern India and even northern India, churches found in other lands where the Nestorians were the majority or plurality of Christians, in Arabia itself, in much of the Eastern Roman Empire, and even in the West long before the schism. So I hope that, having absorbed all this knowledge, you guys will realize this is not some Judaizer Hebrew roots theology. This is traditional of the church. And the idea that Christianity is a religion that, for some reason, we devote a large part of the Bible to laws and the reality of the world. And then E. Michael Jones's version of the Logos pops up, and suddenly we're in a new religion. That's not the case. And the Orthodox Church has never once accepted that idea, and that's why the Orthodox Church believes in theophanies. So a lot of Western theologians, and when I say Western, I don't mean geography. You can belong to Eastern theology, live in New York City, Chicago, doesn't matter what your ethnic background is or what language you speak. But Western theology, so Catholicism and Protestantism, has denied, for the most part, theophanies. And they say, well, the Old Testament's generic monotheism, and the New Testament is where the Trinity comes from. And so that's another great kind of miniature example showing the difference between West and East, because the East says, no, we don't believe in some generic Unitarian God who somehow arbitrarily turns into a Trinitarian God in the New Testament. We're saying that our theology, we're saying our practices, everything comes from the Old Testament. Not Judaizers, but all of this stuff comes from there. So we believe the Trinity is there already in the Pentateuch and the rest of the Old Testament. It didn't pop up out of nowhere in the New Testament. So that's the belief of the Orthodox Church. And so I'm going to do some more videos describing some differences there, but I hope all of you guys enjoy that. You can check and double check all my citations if you'd like, but I have them up here, and I think that this stuff is pretty easy to understand once you contemplate. Actually, don't even contemplate, really. Once you just read the facts that are in front of you. Doing the Sabbath is not Jewish, never will be, never has been. It's part and parcel of what constitutes traditional ancient Christianity that has not been removed of its distinct flavor and characteristics. So thank you guys for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.